Early 1945. Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force. On the maps spread across the operations room, the arrows are still moving forward. The front has not stalled. German resistance continues to bend, sometimes collapse. By military measure, momentum remains an asset. Yet at headquarters, the question is no longer how fast the armies can advance. It is how much that speed now costs elsewhere. Patton's Third Army has become a symbol of relentless pressure. Rapid movement, aggressive exploitation, and an unbroken rhythm of advance have produced results that are difficult to ignore. From the battlefield, momentum looks decisive. Each day gained feels like a day taken from the enemy. From Eisenhower's position, the picture is wider and less forgiving. Every fast advance alters coalition balance. British and French expectations shift. Political leaders watch how territory is entered, not just whether it is taken. Statements, perceptions, and reactions begin to accumulate alongside reports of success. Momentum, once purely operational, now carries political weight. Eisenhower does not question the value of speed. He questions its side effects. As Supreme Allied Commander, the burden does not fall on the general who moves fastest. It falls on the one who must answer for what that movement implies, about control, coordination, and the shape of victory itself. No single incident forces the issue. The cost emerges gradually, through accumulation, rather than crisis. And as it does, Eisenhower recognizes that momentum, left unmanaged, can become a liability he alone must absorb. From this realization, a quiet recalibration begins. By the winter of 1944-45, Allied momentum in Western Europe had reached a paradoxical stage. Militarily, success was undeniable. The breakout from Normandy had shattered German defensive coherence in France. Paris was liberated. Allied armies stood on Germany's borders. Yet the very speed that enabled these gains began to create pressures that were no longer purely military. The Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force existed to manage a coalition, not a single national army. Eisenhower's authority rested on balance, between British and American forces, between military necessity and political expectation, and between the demands of combat and the realities of post-war responsibility. As long as the war remained a fight for liberation, speed simplified those balances. As Allied forces approached Germany itself, speed complicated them. Patton's Third Army exemplified the advantages of rapid exploitation. During the summer and early autumn of 1944, its advances across France demonstrated how momentum could collapse enemy resistance faster than deliberate planning ever could. That experience shaped Patton's operational instincts. To him, speed was not recklessness, it was efficiency. Every pause allowed German forces to regroup. Every delay extended the war. Eisenhower understood the military logic. He had benefited from it. But by late 1944, the environment had changed. The German Ardennes counteroffensive exposed how assumptions made under momentum could be exploited. Even after the crisis was contained, its lesson lingered. Speed, if not coordinated, could magnify risk rather than reduce it. Political context sharpened that risk. Allied governments were no longer focused solely on defeating Germany. They were preparing for occupation, reconstruction, and influence in post-war Europe. The manner in which territory was entered, who entered first, under what authority, and with what public posture, mattered deeply. British leaders were sensitive to perceptions of American dominance. French authorities watched closely for signs of marginalization on their own soil. Every rapid movement carried symbolic meaning. Eisenhower absorbed these pressures directly. As Supreme Allied Commander, He was the public face of Allied unity. Any political friction created by rapid operations did not attach itself to individual field commanders. It attached to chef. Speed that appeared unilateral or uncoordinated risked undermining the carefully maintained coalition narrative. Logistics reinforced this reality. Supply lines strained to keep pace with advancing forces. Fuel shortages forced prioritization between armies. Rail repair lagged behind the front. Decisions about who moved fastest became decisions about who received resources, and therefore political capital. Eisenhower could not allow momentum alone to dictate those choices. German leadership observed these dynamics closely. As Allied advances accelerated, German propaganda sought to portray them as chaotic or domineering rather than liberating. Any hint of Allied disunity or overreach offered material for exploitation. The faster Allied forces moved without visible coordination, the more opportunity existed to shape perception. Patton's momentum, therefore, operated inside a narrowing corridor. What had once been an unqualified advantage now required political and coalition management. Eisenhower's challenge was not to stop speed, but to absorb its consequences without allowing them to fracture alliance cohesion. This context explains why political cost emerged not from failure, but from success. Patton's advances did not create controversy because they stalled or collapsed. They created strain because they worked, sometimes faster than the political framework surrounding them could comfortably accommodate. By early 1945, Eisenhower understood that momentum could no longer be treated as a purely operational variable. It had become a political one. How that momentum was managed would shape not just the final phase of the war, but the authority under which victory would be claimed. From this background, the tension between battlefield success and political responsibility became unavoidable. From Patton's perspective, momentum was not merely a preference. It was a principle shaped by experience. He believed that the enemy's greatest vulnerability lay in hesitation. Every hour of delay allowed German command to reconstitute units, restore communications, and prepare defenses. To Patton, speed reduced political cost by shortening the war itself. The faster Germany collapsed, the fewer problems would remain to manage afterward. Eisenhower viewed the same momentum through a different responsibility. As Supreme Allied Commander, he was accountable for effects that extended beyond the battlefield. Rapid advances altered the balance between Allied armies, shaped public perception, and affected post-war authority. Eisenhower did not question Patton's effectiveness. He questioned whether the coalition could absorb the political implications of speed without appearing divided or uncoordinated. Allied governments evaluated momentum cautiously. British leaders were sensitive to any impression that American forces were determining outcomes unilaterally. French authorities watched the pace of advance for signs that their role in liberation and governance might be diminished. For them, speed was not neutral. It carried meaning about influence and legitimacy. Eisenhower absorbed these concerns directly, often before they became public. Subordinate commanders operated between these pressures. Corps and division leaders understood Patton's emphasis on action, but they also recognized that their movements were now observed through a political lens. Orders that once focused solely on objectives and timing increasingly carried guidance about coordination, boundaries, and visibility. Initiative remained encouraged, but it was no longer unconstrained. The human dimension reinforced this complexity. Soldiers advancing rapidly through towns and cities encountered civilians whose expectations were shaped by occupation and liberation narratives. Discipline, posture, and conduct mattered as much as tactical success. Eisenhower understood that incidents created under rapid movement could escalate politically faster than they could be corrected militarily. German leadership interpreted Allied momentum opportunistically. While unable to halt the advance, German propaganda sought to portray it as disorderly or domineering. Any sign of Allied imbalance offered material to suggest that liberation masked occupation. As long as Allied momentum appeared to outrun coordination, that narrative retained potential value. Each perspective reflected rational priorities. Patton sought decisive collapse. Eisenhower sought coalition cohesion. Allied governments sought assurance. Subordinate commanders sought clarity. German command sought leverage. Momentum interacted with all of them simultaneously. What mattered was not intent, but consequence. Speed produced results, but it also generated effects that did not dissipate at the front line. Eisenhower's political burden grew not because momentum failed, but because it succeeded faster than the coalition's political framework could comfortably manage. As these perspectives converged, momentum itself became the issue. The question was no longer whether to move quickly, but who would pay the cost of doing so. The answer, increasingly, rested at Eisenhower's level of command. The turning point did not come with a crisis that demanded immediate correction. It emerged as Eisenhower recognized that the political cost of momentum was no longer episodic. It was structural. Each rapid movement added to a pattern that could not be explained away as circumstance. Momentum was beginning to define the campaign's political shape as much as its military direction. Eisenhower's response was neither dramatic nor public. He did not attempt to slow Patton through direct reprimand or visible constraint. Instead, he recalibrated how momentum was allowed to function inside the Allied system. The shift was procedural. What had once moved forward on the basis of opportunity now moved forward on the basis of alignment. Approval processes became more explicit. Timing was synchronized more tightly with neighboring armies. Boundaries between formations were reinforced to ensure that rapid advances did not create political imbalance. Eisenhower did not deny Patton the ability to move. He ensured that movement no longer appeared unilateral, even when it was effective. This recalibration reflected a deeper conclusion. Eisenhower understood that political cost could not be eliminated by explanation after the fact. Once perceptions formed, among allies, civilians, or governments, they hardened quickly. The only reliable way to reduce that cost was to prevent it from accumulating in the first place. Momentum had to be managed before it translated into political meaning. For Patton, the change was tangible. His advances continued, but the conditions under which they occurred were narrower. Speed remained valuable, but it had to operate within visible coordination. Actions that once appeared as pure exploitation now required confirmation that they fit the coalition's broader narrative. The battlefield logic remained sound, but it no longer stood alone. This moment removed alternatives quietly. Eisenhower could not continue absorbing political strain indefinitely without risking alliance cohesion. Nor could he allow momentum to define the campaign's political outcome by default. Regulation became unavoidable. The system adjusted to ensure that military success did not generate political vulnerability. German command observed the change in rhythm. Allied pressure remained constant, but its presentation shifted. Rapid thrusts were embedded within coordinated movements. Opportunities to exploit Allied imbalance diminished as cohesion became more visible. German efforts increasingly focused on delay rather than political exploitation. At the coalition level, Eisenhower's approach reassured partners. British and French leaders saw that momentum would not override political balance. Authority remained centralized. No single commander appeared to be shaping outcomes independently. This reassurance mattered as the war approached its final phase, when post-war positioning loomed large. The climax, therefore, was not an order to slow down. It was Eisenhower's decision to internalize the political cost of speed and redesign the command environment around it. Momentum would continue, but it would be framed, coordinated, and bounded in ways that reduced exposure. From this point forward, Patton's advances no longer carried the same political weight, not because they were less effective, but because Eisenhower had altered how that effectiveness translated beyond the battlefield. The political cost of momentum did not disappear. It was redistributed, managed, and contained. Once this adjustment was made, its effects became unavoidable. The campaign moved into its final phase under a new equilibrium, one in which speed was no longer free, but it was still decisive. The consequences of Eisenhower's recalibration were not immediately visible on the battlefield, but they were felt across the coalition. Momentum continued, yet its political cost shifted. Where Eisenhower had previously absorbed strain reactively, he now managed it proactively. The burden did not disappear. It was redistributed through process. For Patton's Third Army, the most immediate consequence was a change in how success was framed. Advances were no longer judged solely by speed or distance gained. They were evaluated by how well they fit within coalition rhythm. Patton retained operational effectiveness, but his momentum no longer translated directly into political leverage. Credit was shared, coordination emphasized, and visibility managed. What he gained in continued freedom of movement, he lost in singular prominence. Eisenhower, meanwhile, continued to carry the political weight upward. Allied leaders still directed concerns toward Chef rather than individual field commanders. Eisenhower accepted this role deliberately. By insulating aggressive commanders from direct political fallout, he preserved their utility while protecting coalition unity. The cost was personal and institutional. Eisenhower became the buffer through which friction passed. At the alliance level, the consequences were stabilizing. British and French leadership observed that rapid American advances would not marginalize their interests or authority. Decisions appeared collective rather than competitive. This perception mattered as discussions about occupation zones, governance, and post-war influence accelerated. Military movement no longer threatened political positioning. Subordinate commanders benefited from clearer expectations. The revised framework reduced uncertainty about where initiative was encouraged and where restraint was required. Planning improved as parameters became predictable. While some flexibility was sacrificed, reliability increased. Operations unfolded with fewer disruptive adjustments mid-execution. German forces experienced the effects indirectly. Allied coordination reduced opportunities to exploit imbalance or present propaganda narratives of Allied disunity. German command focused increasingly on delaying actions rather than attempting to shape political outcomes through Allied missteps. As momentum became disciplined, its political exposure narrowed. The strategic consequence was endurance. Progress slowed slightly in places, but it became harder to reverse. Territory gained was held. Supply stabilized. The risk of political backlash undermining military success diminished. Eisenhower's management ensured that speed did not outrun legitimacy. What Eisenhower paid politically was not loss of authority, but responsibility. He absorbed pressure that might otherwise have fractured command relationships. In doing so, he preserved both momentum and cohesion. The cost was real, but it was controlled. By the time the war approached its final movements, the system Eisenhower had shaped no longer felt restrictive. It felt necessary. Momentum still mattered, but it now moved within limits designed to protect the alliance that sustained it.